You are traveling through another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of the imagination. Your next stop, the Literary Lair. The Twilight Zone is one of the most well-known television series that has ever existed. Even if you've never actually seen it, which I find really hard to believe, it's always been around, be it through the original 1959 series, the two revivals in the 80s and early 2000s respectively, the feature film, various parodies, or from the newest attempt to revive it, featuring Rod Serling's narrator duties taken over by comedy and horror icon Jordan Peele. And really, if anyone was going to be able to do the Rod Serling thing, it's Jordan Peele. He is amazingly sinister when he wants to be. I love The Twilight Zone, and it was one of my favorite TV shows when I was a kid, mainly because it was never the same thing twice. You always got something different, and the show was always exciting. Plus, there's always a chance of spotting an actor that would later appear on Star Trek, which makes watching it really fun. And to celebrate the legacy of the show, and because The Twilight Zone is going to be pretty big this week, given that the revival just premiered, I figured I'd count down my favorite episodes of the original series. Why just the original one? Mainly because I've only really seen those. I didn't really watch either of the two revivals, and the newest one is, well, too new for me to really form an opinion on yet. But since I film on Thursdays and it premiered on Monday, I can firmly say that I think that the new Twilight Zone is really damn good. The first episode is exactly the type of concept that's perfect for the show, and executed just like the original series was. While I think that the show works better with 30-minute episodes instead of hour-long, this version of the format allows them to really draw out the suspense, and I'm willing to go along. And unlike many reboots, they kept in the intro sequence, and Jordan Peele kills it doing the Rod Serling narration. Anyway, imagine a video where the content creator counts down their favorite episodes of an iconic series. And remember that these choices are just his opinion, and will probably contain the classics, but might not contain your personal favorite. The old adage goes, opinions are like armpits, everyone has them, but no two people share the same ones. Without further ado, these are my top 10 classic Twilight Zone episodes. So this would be where, oh, wait a minute, oh yeah, you guys probably aren't going to sit through an entire video in black and white, are you? So, Iota, activate the variable chromatic sequencer.
Aye, master.
Ah, that's better. Thanks, Iota. This would normally be where a normal content creator would put the honorable mentions, episodes that everyone loves and should have made the list, but didn't because these are just my personal top 10 that I personally like. Rest assured that if an episode you enjoyed didn't make the list, there's a good chance that I still do like it, just not as much as these entries. But there is one episode that I want to talk about that I absolutely despise. Dishonorable mention, The Fugitive. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about this one, but if I'm talking classic Twilight Zone, I can't not bring this one up. This episode is super friggin' creepy. The premise of the episode is that there's this old man named Ben, right? And he plays with the neighborhood kids, and that's not creepy because his secret is that he's a shapeshifter and he can turn into monsters when they play games, like Monsters versus Kids or whatever. And there's this one girl, Jenny, that he specifically cares for because she's got leg braces and can't play with the other kids. And he's an alien, so people from his home planet come to Earth to find him because he's their king, and they have to bring him back. But he didn't like being king because there's a lot of, red tape and bureaucracy. So, before he leaves, he heals Jenny's legs, and she doesn't need the leg brace anymore. But the alien guards that came after him figure out that he likes her, so they use her as bait, and he goes to help her, so they end up trapping him. He's left no choice and has to go back, and Jenny, who doesn't really have a great home life, she's an orphan, and her aunt is kind of crappy, she says, "Oh, why don't you take me with you?" And his aliens are like, "No, we're not going to do that." So they let him say goodbye, and he transforms into an identical copy of her. So that way they have to bring them both back because there's no way to distinguish them, which you'd think the alien shapeshifters would be able to do, but whatever. And so they end up leaving, and, everyone ends up happy at the end. She gets to live on an alien world with working legs, they get their king back, and it's all good. That is until the final moments, where Rod Serling's narration reveals that Jenny will eventually become Ben's queen. Yeah, not only is the actor who played Ben 60 years old at the time the episode was made, but I don't care if he turned out to look younger than he was in his disguise. She only knew him as an old man, and she ends up marrying him? Just super creepy. Anyway, let's talk about some good episodes now. Number 10, The Twilight Zone Terror of Terror, Disney's Hollywood Studios. Okay, so this one isn't technically an episode, but since we're talking Twilight Zone, I figured this might be my only chance to talk about it on this show. Plus, I've been in a theme park mood since doing the April Fool's Day video last week, so let's do this. This is one of my favorite rides from any Disney park. I love drop towers, but what I love even more are rides with a lot of theming and lore behind them. Plus, I have a soft spot for the TV movie based on the ride. Might make a good Halloween video one of these days now that I think about it. I always enjoyed the ride as a kid, even if this picture doesn't make it seem like I did. It's a thin premise, and it barely counts as an episode, but I like the lore and the stuff from the movie, and even if it has its problems, plus I can definitely say that it's the most thrilling and reaction-inducing Twilight Zone property that exists, given that it can literally move people to tears. Number 9, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. This one is also not technically an episode of the show, even though it aired as such, given that it was filmed by Robert Enrico and then licensed by the show and given an opening and closing wraparound segment featuring Rod Serling. But it's still really damn good. I first saw it in a film class in college. I had just never gotten around to watching it on the show, and it was amazing. And then watching it with the Rod Serling wraparound just makes it even more amazing. The fact that it manages to tell a coherent story with very limited dialogue is a testament to Enrico's talent, and a testament to how stories don't have to be in your face with exposition, as A Quiet Place showed us last year. The way that experiencing it for the first time, my stomach dropped the moment that the fantasy gave way to reality, ensured that it was going to leave a permanent mark on my psyche. And if I thought I had any substantial analysis to offer on the story, I'd love to cover the short story it was based on one day. But as it stands, this is not only a fine short film, but it's also a fine addition to the Twilight Zone family. Number 8, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. This was obviously going to be on here. Not only is it one of the most memorable episodes of the show, and one that everyone likes to reference, and Shatner gives a brilliant performance, but it was one of the first episodes that I can remember watching. When I was a kid, I'd watch Twilight Zone when they did their annual July 4th marathon on sci-fi, and this was obviously one of the ones that they chose for it. And I also remember renting a VHS with this episode on it from Hollywood Video a few times. So that gives you an idea of how young I was when I first saw this. And this one is amazing. The slow, drawn-out paranoia that Shatner goes through. And I don't care how dated it looks, that gremlin is still just as creepy today. I don't feel like I have to defend this choice that much, and the only reason it's so low on the list is because it's so damn obvious that I didn't want to make you wait around to see it. Overall, it's a great episode and an utter classic. Number 7, A Penny for Your Thoughts. I like this one because it's an uncharacteristically happy story, where the main character uses his powers for good. Sure, with the help of Helen, he uses it for personal gain, but ultimately in the service of goodness, given that he protects the bank and helps Old Man Smithers. The premise is solid, Dick York really sells it as Hector Poole, and I was really invested in his journey. While I like the unsettling premises, or the ones where bad people get a comeuppance, this one is fun because we see deserving people get rewarded and the bad guys get punished. Plus, it's a really interesting look into the way that people have a penchant for saying one thing when they really feel the opposite. And unique for telepathy stories where the main character is actually relieved to lose their newfound power because he got everything he needed from it. It very easily could have been an episode about a nosy person getting the power and being driven mad by knowing every thought, but they took a lighter approach, and one that I think works better, and left me utterly satisfied with knowing that Hector and Helen will end up happy together, and Smithers gets his trip after all, and he didn't have to rob the bank to do it. Number 6. Time Enough at Last. This episode holds a special place in my heart, and if you haven't already figured out why, it's because it's about a man who loves reading almost above anything else, which I can kind of understand. And what strikes me the most about this is while most Twilight Zone episodes are supposed to be cautionary tales, where you don't so much sympathize with the main character because they're being taught a lesson, but in this one, everyone is a dick to Henry. I'm not saying that he should be reading while on the job or to the extent of ignoring human interaction. No matter how tempting that might be sometimes, there's a time and a place, but his wife not embracing his interests, and especially how she covered up all the words in the book in an attempt to dissuade him from reading, and how she just straight up tricked him by pretending that she had an interest in his reading just so he'd check out the book beforehand. What a bitch! And as much as the horrifying content in most of the other episodes had knotted my stomach, I don't think there's a visceral reaction that I felt more than the nausea that I felt as Henry's wife tore up the book.
I say it's dog rule. I also say it's a waste of time.
Oh God, oh God, no. It's okay. It's okay, the mean lady can't hurt you anymore. The mean lady can't hurt you anymore. Now, I'm not saying that it would be preferable to live in a post-nuclear holocaust just to be able to read, but you can't deny how utterly crappy people were being to Henry before the bombs went off. There's a difference between an unreasonable amount of reading and what he was doing, especially at home, where when his wife asked him to read her the poetry, his reaction made it seem like she has never asked him that question before, ever, so she's in the wrong for doing that. The fact that the episode inspired that much thought is a testament to the quality of the writing. Even in the 50s, people were talking about when books would go out of style, something that thankfully, in the 60 years since this episode's debut, has not happened yet. If it did, I'd be out of a hobby. And the other themes of loneliness versus solitude, where even if Bemis did want to be left alone, he didn't want to be that alone, are well done as well. Burgess Meredith excels at the part, which is why this one is one of the finest episodes that there is. Because as good as the story is, it's Henry's final agonized screams that really sell it. Number 5, Eye of the Beholder. This one is another classic that's in every marathon and every parody. Plus, it's got a good timeless message about conventional beauty, and the dangers of only liking the conventionally attractive people, because eventually, you might end up shipping those people away from us normal folk. It's a little obvious, and the surprise is undercut after the first viewing, but I will never get tired of it, and I can appreciate it more as an adult for the creative framing and cinematography, which is done amazingly well, and of course, the amazing emotive acting, despite the fact that apart from the main character at the very end, we very rarely see anyone show emotion, and yet we're able to feel it. The part where Dr. Bernardi is talking to the nurse about how much he truly wants to help Janet, even to the extent of talking out against their leader. And the director, Douglas Hayes, did a great job with the cast, because their voices are what truly makes the difference. You can't expect people to sit through 15 minutes of shadowy faces without having amazing vocal acting. Which is probably why Todd in the Shadows has been able to hide his face for so long. He's got a good voice. And the same is true with this episode. It might be a predictable choice for the list, but it's a phenomenal story, executed phenomenally well. Number 4, Equality of Mercy. Going back to my earlier statement of being able to spot future Star Trek actors, this one features both Dean Stockwell, who appeared in Enterprise, and Leonard Nimoy. And while the version from the 1980 film is probably more well-known due to the real-life deaths involved, and this one suffers from the use of yellowface since Dean Stockwell's lieutenant is made up to appear Asian, but at least the entire purpose of the scene was the fact that he was a white dude and not an Asian from the start. The message of seeing the other side as humans and not the enemy is good. I mean, one of my favorite lines from MASH will always be,
Wendell, another word for gooks is people.
And the progression, showing the lieutenant his callousness from the perspective of the other side, was inspired. The faux Asian accent that Dean Stockwell puts on can be a tad uncomfortable with our current standards, but keeping it in the context that it's in, you can look past it. And what are the friggin' odds that Dean Stockwell in 1961 would star in a sci-fi series that features him traveling into the relatively recent past and facing a mirror image that was not his own? And yet, Quantum Leap featured Stockwell as a part of a very similar plot. The fact that he learns his lesson and is able to change his viewpoint without being subjected to torment for all eternity makes it all the better, because we know that the change will ultimately end up saving many lives that would have normally been otherwise senselessly thrown away, like that colonel from MASH that BJ refused to do an appendectomy on. Number 3. Nick of Time. Another Shatner appearance, and the reason that Nightmare at 20,000 Feet was so far down the list. I didn't want the two Shatner episodes so close to each other, and this one is definitely the lesser known of the two. I know that because as a kid, I remembered this episode vividly. I remembered the little devil bobblehead machine. I remembered the plot of the episode. But what I had forgotten was that the star of the episode was William Shatner. So when I sought this episode out when I was older, I was blown away that Captain Kirk was in this episode too. This is one episode that's really chilling, despite the fact that nothing supernatural really happens. Sure, there's the little messages from the Mystic Seer, but there's no monster. The only monster is the specter of knowing too much about your own future. It does a lot with very little, and it really hinges on Shatner and Patricia Breslin's acting being so strong. Shatner has a really good range and shows the progression into paranoia really well, just like he would later do in the more well-known episode. And Breslin, as the grounded one who starts to doubt herself as Shatner gets more and more lost, makes it a very tense episode. The fact that we know that the happy couple move past this and see another couple in their same situation returning to the diner at the end gives it a bittersweet sort of feeling that really is the icing on the cake. Number 2, Death's Head Revisited. Death's Head is surprisingly relevant for our times and a really dark entry in the series. Of course, in the context of the time it was made, having been written as a response to the Eichmann trial, this makes sense. The episode is timeless, as the former SS officer Lutz explains how the past is the past, and everyone should just move past that whole Holocaust thing. Speaks volumes about how not just the Holocaust, but those people who will say that slavery and segregation and racism are things of the past, when the effects are still being felt today, just like the effects of the Holocaust are felt every day. I actually discovered this one and my number 1 choice from a comic book adaptation that was done of them. Reading it made me want to see the episode, and as good as that comic was, it did very little to prepare me for how truly chilling this episode was. Oscar Beregi screaming as his former prisoners take their retribution on him is amazingly well done, and they couldn't have picked anyone better to play Lutz. The ending monologue from Serling really sells it, and legitimately gave me goosebumps. And like with some of the other entries on this list, there is very fascinating cinematography going on, with the ghostly Nazi Lutz on Lutz's shoulder during his flashbacks. Seeing both of them standing next to each other, the older nostalgic man and the ruthless captain, makes it all the more powerful. Really, I just want you, if you haven't already, to go seek this episode out yourself. It's on Netflix and Amazon Prime, because that's really the only way to get what I'm saying. Number 1, Walking Distance. This one is my absolute favorite. Not only does it involve time travel, but it's got a good message about nostalgia. The past is nice, but we've got to keep moving on, and if you don't, you might end up hurting yourself permanently. Not as permanently as giving your childhood self a debilitating leg injury that results in a lifelong limp, but almost as bad. Like I said before, I actually first read this from a comic adaptation along with Death's Head Revisited, and the comic was really good too, showing that the story works regardless of medium. And it's a little bit ironic, given that both these episodes feature the dangers of nostalgia. Since, after all, if Lutz never returned to the camp out of his misguided nostalgia, he'd still be living happily in Brazil. And this episode shows that even the good-natured, harmless nostalgia can have dire consequences if you don't move past the past. It can be very tempting to want to remain in the past, in your childhood, because you don't have the same responsibilities, the same things holding you back. But the future has a lot to offer as well, and I like that instead of glorifying the past, we're shown that as much as we love it, we have to live in the now. And Gig Young expertly plays the part of Martin Sloan, and his progression into becoming more and more desperate to cling to his past is done extremely well. Being an adult sucks, but we can't retreat into our past. All we end up doing is damage to ourselves. Come to think of it, this might be a good cautionary tale for all those people concerned about cartoon reboots that ruin their childhood. Unless you fell off a carousel as a kid and gave yourself a permanent limp because your future self was harassing you, I think your childhood is going to be okay, even though Thundercats has a different animation style. The music is also amazing and underscores the episode perfectly, better than any other Twilight Zone episode I can think of, probably because the music was written for this episode specifically. Overall, this is one of the best outings that the Twilight Zone has ever had, and it's absolutely my favorite episode of the original run. And those were my top 10 classic Twilight Zone episodes. Did I showcase your favorites? Was there an episode that I neglected to put in the top list that you liked? Honestly, I'm interested in hearing other opinions, so tell me about your favorites in the comments. And if you agree with me or have any discussion to add to my entries, go ahead and share those as well. I really enjoyed going back and rewatching all my old favorites for the list. Next week, however, it's back to Patreon-sponsored reviews. Not Couture 2 yet, but instead a review of Tomorrow When the War Began, an Australian novel that's been adapted into a movie and a television series. Which one will I be looking at? Find out next time. See you next time. Fuck, I reacted early.